The 12-year-old bride lay bleeding on the wedding sheets, but not from what you think. Her new husband had given her wedding jewels to another man, and when she protested, he carved his initials into her palm with the very dagger she had gifted him, whispering, "Now you'll remember who you belong to." 20 years later, Isabella would carve something far deeper into his kingdom. They called her Isabella the Fair. Beautiful Isabella, the rose of France, but roses have thorns, and this particular bloom would draw blood from the very heart of England itself. She was 12 years old when she first stepped onto English soil in the winter of 1308, her breath forming clouds in the bitter air, her eyes reflecting a wisdom that should not have belonged to one so young. The courtiers who greeted her saw only what they expected to see: a child bride, fresh-faced and innocent, sent from her father's court to cement an alliance between two great kingdoms. They could not have been more wrong. The marriage ceremony at Westminster Abbey was a spectacle of unprecedented grandeur. Hundreds of nobles filled the sacred space, their silk and velvet robes rustling like the wings of carrion birds. Candles flickered in golden sconces, casting dancing shadows across the stone faces of long-dead kings. The Archbishop's voice echoed through the vaulted ceiling as he spoke the ancient words that would bind Isabella of France to Edward II of England until death should part them. Death, such a distant concept for a 12-year-old girl standing before God and country in her wedding gown of white silk, her golden hair crowned with flowers, her hands trembling not from fear, but from something else entirely, something that those who witnessed the ceremony would later remember with a chill of recognition, though they could not name it then. Edward II stood beside his child bride, 24 years old and undeniably handsome, his dark hair catching the candlelight, his strong hands steady as he placed the ring upon Isabella's finger. To the assembled nobles, he appeared every inch the king his father had wanted him to be. They could not see what Isabella saw in that moment, the way his eyes searched the crowd not for approval, but for another face. The way his attention drifted even as he spoke his sacred vows. The way his body seemed to recoil, almost imperceptibly, from her touch. But Isabella saw. Isabella remembered, and Isabella would never forgive. The coronation feast that followed was a masterpiece of medieval pageantry. Swan and peacock graced the high table, their feathers artfully arranged to suggest life even in death. Wine flowed like rivers of blood, and the air thrummed with the music of lutes and harps. Yet amid all this splendor, one detail went largely unnoticed by the celebrating nobles. The new queen sat alone at the head table, while her husband lavished attention on a young courtier with fair hair and knowing smile, Piers Gaveston. The name would an echo through Isabella's nightmares for years to come, but not in the way anyone expected. The child bride said nothing that night. She ate her wedding feast in silence, her dark eyes moving between her husband and his favorite like a cat watching mice. When courtiers approached to offer congratulations, she smiled with perfect grace and spoke in the careful diplomatic phrases she had been taught. But inside, behind those dark eyes, something was taking root. Something patient and calculating and utterly merciless. The weeks that followed revealed the true nature of Isabella's new life. By day, she performed the duties expected of a queen, receiving petitioners, attending court functions, learning the intricate protocols of English nobility. By night, she lay alone in the great bed of the royal chambers, staring up at the canopy and listening to the whispered conversations that drifted through the stone corridors. Conversations about her husband's unusual friendship with Piers Gaveston. Conversations about the king's neglect of his young bride. Conversations about the dangerous precedent being set by a monarch who seemed more interested in his male companion than in producing an heir. But Isabella was learning. Always learning. She observed how power flowed through the court like water finding its level. She noted which nobles commanded respect and which were dismissed with contempt. She studied the intricate web of alliances and enmities that determined who lived comfortably and who lived in fear. Most importantly, she began to understand that in a world ruled by men, a woman's greatest weapon was not beauty or charm, but intelligence, and Isabella possessed intelligence in abundance. The turning point came during the winter of 1309. Isabella had been married for nearly a year, yet she remained a virgin. The situation was becoming a source of increasing concern among the nobility, who understood that an unconsummated royal marriage could be annulled at any moment. Whispers began to circulate about the king's unnatural preferences, about his spending entire nights closeted with Gaveston in private chambers, about his apparent inability to perform his marital duties with his young wife. Isabella heard these whispers, but she did not react as others expected. Where another woman might have wept or raged or retreated into wounded silence, Isabella began to plan. She understood now that her position was precarious, that without a child to cement her place in the royal succession, she was nothing more than a decorative ornament that could be discarded at will. But she also understood something else. The very weakness of her position could become a source of strength if she was clever enough to exploit it. Her first move was subtle but brilliant. Rather than competing with Gaveston for Edward's attention, she began to cultivate a friendship with the king's favorite. It was a dangerous gambit. If Gaveston saw through her intentions, he could easily poison Edward against her. But Isabella was young enough to seem harmless, intelligent enough to make herself useful, and calculating enough to hide her true feelings behind a mask of sisterly affection. The strategy worked better than she had dared hope. Gaveston, secure in his hold over the king, and perhaps flattered by the young queen's apparent admiration, began to treat her as a confidant. He shared gossip about the court, complained about the hostility of the barons, and even sought her advice on political matters. Edward, pleased to see his wife and his favorite getting along so well, began to include Isabella in their private conversations and evening entertainments. For the first time since her arrival in England, Isabella felt the intoxicating taste of real power. But it was a fragile thing, dependent on the whims of two men who had no idea they were being manipulated by someone they considered little more than a child. The lesson in mortality came sooner than anyone expected. In the summer of 1312, a group of English barons finally acted on their long-simmering resentment of Gaveston's influence. They surrounded his stronghold, captured him after a brief siege, and executed him without trial. The man who had been the most powerful person in England after the king himself was dead within a matter of hours, his body left to rot as a warning to others who might seek to rise above their station. Isabella received the news while she was in the final weeks of pregnancy with her first child. She was 20 years old now, no longer the frightened child bride who had arrived from France 4 years earlier. The young woman who listened to the messenger's report of Gaveston's death showed no visible emotion. She merely nodded, thanked the man for his service, and retired to her chambers to await the birth of her son. But inside, behind the carefully composed facade, Isabella was analyzing every aspect of what had just occurred. She had seen how quickly even the most powerful favorite could fall. She had witnessed the ruthless efficiency with which the English nobility disposed of those who threatened their interests. Most importantly, she had learned that in the brutal world of medieval politics, there were only two types of people, those who held power and those who were destroyed by it. She would never again allow herself to be among the latter. The child born to Isabella that November would one day be known as Edward III, one of England's greatest warrior kings. But on the night of his birth, as Isabella held her son for the first time and felt his tiny fingers grasp her own, she was thinking not of the future, but of the present. She had given England its heir. She had secured her position as queen, and she had done it all while maintaining the facade of a dutiful, loving wife to a husband who had shown her nothing but neglect and indifference. The irony was not lost on her. She had succeeded where Gaveston, for all his power and influence, had ultimately failed. She had survived. The years that followed brought a succession of crises that tested Isabella's newfound security. England suffered military humiliations in Scotland, where Robert the Bruce's forces repeatedly outmaneuvered Edward's armies. The Great Famine swept across Europe, bringing starvation and disease to England's countryside. Political tensions between the king and his nobles reached new heights as Edward's ineffectual leadership became increasingly apparent to all. Through it all, Isabella played her role to perfection. She bore Edward 3 more children, cementing her position as the mother of the royal line. She entertained foreign dignitaries with grace and intelligence, earning praise for her diplomatic skills. She supported her husband publicly while privately building her own network of allies and informants throughout the English court. But beneath the surface, something darker was growing. Isabella had learned to hide her true feelings so well that she sometimes wondered if she still possessed any genuine emotions at all. She could smile at her husband across a crowded hall while simultaneously planning his destruction. She could cradle her children with maternal tenderness while calculating how best to use them as political pawns. She had become exactly what her environment demanded, a creature of pure calculation, beautiful and charming, and utterly without mercy. The final catalyst came in the form of Hugh Despenser the Younger, the courtier who would become Edward's last and most destructive favorite. Unlike Gaveston, who had at least possessed charm and political acumen, Hugh Despenser was a creature of pure greed and ambition. He cared nothing for England's welfare, nothing for the king's reputation, nothing for anyone or anything except his own advancement. From the moment Hugh Despenser entered Edward's inner circle, Isabella knew that he represented an existential threat to everything she had built. Where Gaveston had merely ignored her, Despenser actively worked to undermine her influence. He poisoned Edward's mind against her, convinced the king to confiscate her lands, and even went so far as to remove her younger children from her custody and place them in his own household. It was a declaration of war, though Despenser was too arrogant to realize it. Isabella's response was characteristically patient and methodical. She made no dramatic gestures, issued no public protests, gave no sign that she considered Despenser anything more than a minor annoyance. Instead, she began to plan with the cold precision of a chess master, contemplating checkmate several moves in advance. The opportunity came in 1325, when tensions between England and France required diplomatic intervention. Edward, unwilling to leave his realm while facing such widespread domestic opposition, sent Isabella to negotiate with her brother Charles IV. It was exactly the opening she had been waiting for. Once in France, Isabella shed the mask she had worn for 17 years of marriage. She refused Edward's increasingly desperate demands that she return to England. She publicly declared that Hugh Despenser had destroyed her marriage and that she would rather live in exile than submit to his abuse. Most shocking of all, she began an open affair with Roger Mortimer, an English exile who had escaped from the Tower of London and who possessed both the military skills and the political connections necessary to mount an invasion of England. The transformation was stunning in its completeness. The dutiful wife who had endured years of neglect and humiliation was gone, replaced by a woman of steel and venom who would stop at nothing to reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers. Isabella had finally revealed her true nature, and it was more terrifying than anyone had imagined. The invasion, when it came in September 1326, was swift and devastating. Isabella and Mortimer landed on England's eastern coast with a small but disciplined army, and Edward's support collapsed almost immediately. Nobles who had served the crown for generations flocked to Isabella's banner. Common soldiers abandoned their posts rather than fight against the wronged queen. Within weeks, Edward and the Despensers were fugitives in their own kingdom. The capture was almost anticlimactic. Edward and Hugh Despenser were found hiding in Wales. Their once magnificent court reduced to a handful of desperate men cowering in castle ruins. The king, who had once commanded the loyalty of millions, was now a broken man, aged beyond his years, his eyes hollow with the knowledge of his own failure. Hugh Despenser's execution was a masterpiece of medieval brutality. Isabella stood on the walls of Hereford Castle and watched as her enemy was dragged through the streets, hanged until nearly dead, then disemboweled while still conscious. The crowd's cheers echoed across the countryside as Despenser's body was finally quartered and displayed as a warning to others who might dare to cross the she-wolf of France. But even as she watched her enemy's agonizing death, Isabella felt no satisfaction. Revenge, she had discovered, was a hollow pleasure. It could not restore the years of humiliation she had endured, could not erase the memory of all the nights she had lain awake plotting and planning and dreaming of this moment. All it could do was clear the path for the next phase of her plan. Edward II's fate was more complex. As Isabella's lawful husband and the anointed King of England, he could not simply be executed like a common traitor. Parliament was convened to formally depose him, transferring the crown to his 14-year-old son under Isabella's regency. The former king was then quietly removed to Berkeley Castle, where he would spend his remaining days in comfortable but secure captivity. For 8 months, Edward lingered in his stone prison, a living reminder of Isabella's ultimate victory. Then, on September 21st, 1327, word came that the former king had died in the night. The official cause was given as natural illness, but rumors spread like wildfire through the kingdom. Rumors of midnight visitors, rumors of muffled screams, rumors of a death so horrible that even the castle guards refused to speak of what they had witnessed. Isabella, when informed of her husband's death, showed no more emotion than she had upon hearing of Gaveston's execution 15 years earlier. She ordered a magnificent funeral, attended the service in appropriate mourning attire, and played the role of the grieving widow with her usual flawless performance. If she had ordered Edward's murder, and the truth of that would be debated by historians for centuries to come, she gave no sign of guilt or remorse. She had achieved everything she had ever wanted. She was the Queen Mother of England, regent for a young king who depended entirely on her guidance. Her lover Roger Mortimer was the most powerful man in the kingdom after herself. Her enemies were dead or fled into exile. She possessed wealth beyond imagination and commanded the fear and respect of all who encountered her. And she was utterly, completely miserable. Power, Isabella discovered, was a cold companion. The courtiers who bowed and scraped before her did so out of fear, not love. The nobles who sought her favor were motivated by their own ambition, not genuine loyalty. Even her children seemed to regard her with a mixture of awe and wariness that spoke more of intimidation than affection. Worst of all was the knowledge of what she had become. The innocent girl who had arrived from France 2 decades earlier was gone, replaced by a creature of such calculated cruelty that she sometimes frightened herself. She had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams, but the price of that success had been her own humanity. The end, when it came, was as swift and merciless as everything else in Isabella's life. In October 1330, her own son Edward III staged a coup against her and Mortimer. The young king, now 17 and chafing under his mother's regency, surrounded Nottingham Castle with loyal troops and arrested both the Queen Mother and her lover in their bedchamber. Isabella's final moment of true emotion came as she watched the guards drag Mortimer away to his execution. She threw herself at her son's feet, begging for her lover's life with tears streaming down her face. "Fair son," she cried, "have pity on gentle Mortimer." But Edward III had learned his lessons well from his mother's example. He showed no mercy. Mortimer was hanged 2 days later, his body left to rot on the gallows as a warning to all who might threaten the king's authority. Isabella, spared execution only because of her royal blood and her role as the king's mother, was sentenced to comfortable house arrest at Windsor Castle. She would live for nearly 30 more years, a wealthy and honored dowager queen, but never again would she wield real power. In her final decades, Isabella became something of a curiosity among the English nobility. Visitors to her court were struck by the contradiction between her reputation as the she-wolf of France and the reality of the elegant, cultured woman who entertained them with wit and grace. She dressed in the finest silks and jewels, surrounded herself with books and art and music, and seemed to have found a kind of peace that had eluded her during her years of power. But those who looked closely could see the truth beneath the surface. Isabella's eyes held a coldness that no amount of refinement could mask. Her smile never quite reached those eyes, and her laughter had a brittle quality that spoke of long-suppressed pain. She was beautiful still, indeed, more beautiful than ever in her mature years. But it was the beauty of a perfectly preserved weapon, elegant and deadly, and forever poised to strike. She died at Hertford Castle on August 22, 1358, at the age of 63. Her funeral was a magnificent affair, attended by nobles from across Europe who came to pay their respects to one of the most remarkable women of her age. She was buried in the Greyfriars Church in London, wearing the same wedding dress she had worn 50 years earlier when she first pledged herself to Edward II. According to some accounts, she was also buried with Edward's heart resting upon her breast, a final, grotesque reminder of the marriage that had shaped both their destinies. Whether this detail was true or merely a romantic fiction invented by later chroniclers, it captured something essential about Isabella's story. She had begun her adult life joined to Edward in holy matrimony, and even death could not completely sever the twisted bond between them. But perhaps the most fitting epitaph for Isabella of France was not found in any chronicle or carved upon any tombstone. It was discovered much later in a letter written by one of her contemporaries shortly after her death. She was the most beautiful woman in Christendom and the most dangerous. Those who loved her found only betrayal. Those who trusted her found only destruction. She was everything a queen should be and everything a woman should not. God grant that we never see her like again. Yet even as these words were being written, across Europe, other young girls were being prepared for political marriages. Other child brides were learning to navigate the treacherous waters of medieval court life. Other potential she-wolves were discovering the terrible price of survival in a world ruled by men. Isabella's story was ending, but the pattern she had established, the transformation of innocence into calculation, of vulnerability into viciousness, of love into something far more dangerous, would repeat itself again and again throughout the centuries to come. For Isabella of France had taught the world a lesson that would never be forgotten, that sometimes the most beautiful roses grow in the darkest soil, and their thorns are always sharper than their petals are soft. She had been a child bride, a neglected wife, a wronged woman seeking justice, but in the end, she had become something else entirely, a force of nature that reshaped the destiny of nations and left a trail of destruction that would echo through history long after her bones had turned to dust. The crown was not made of gold, it was made of betrayal, and Isabella of France wore it better than any monarch before or since, until the very weight of it crushed everything human within her and left only the wolf behind. In the centuries that followed Isabella's death, chroniclers and historians would struggle to understand the woman who had been both queen and destroyer, both victim and predator. Some painted her as a wronged wife, driven to desperate measures by an impossible situation. Others condemned her as a scheming adulteress who murdered her own husband for power. The truth, as always, was far more complex than either interpretation suggested. Isabella's tragedy was not that she was evil, but that she was human. Thrust into an impossible situation at the age of 12, married to a man who could never love her, Surrounded by enemies who sought to use or destroy her, she had done what any intelligent person might do. She had adapted. She had learned the rules of the game being played around her and had played it better than anyone else. The fact that those rules demanded the sacrifice of everything decent and compassionate within her was not her fault. It was the fault of a world that offered women like her no other path to survival. But if Isabella was a victim of her circumstances, she was also something more. A warning. Her story demonstrated what happened when human beings were pushed beyond their moral limits, when survival demanded the abandonment of conscience, when power became more important than humanity. She had gained the whole world and lost her soul, and in doing so, had shown future generations the true cost of absolute ambition. The historical records that survive from Isabella's time paint a picture of a woman who inspired both admiration and terror in equal measure. Her contemporaries described her as brilliant, beautiful, and utterly ruthless. She could charm foreign ambassadors with her wit and grace, then order the execution of her enemies without a flicker of emotion. She could play the loving mother with her children, then use them as pawns in her political games. She could weep genuine tears for her fallen lover, then calmly plan the destruction of anyone who threatened her position. This complexity made her both fascinating and frightening to those who knew her. Isabella was not a simple villain who could be easily categorized and dismissed. She was a fully realized human being who had been shaped by forces beyond her control into something monstrous, yet who retained enough of her original humanity to make her actions all the more disturbing. The physical descriptions of Isabella that survive from her lifetime reinforce this sense of beautiful menace. Contemporary chroniclers invariably mentioned her extraordinary beauty. The golden hair inherited from her father, Philip the Fair, the dark eyes that seemed to see everything, the elegant figure that commanded attention in any room. But they also noted something unsettling about her presence, a quality that made even brave men uncomfortable in her company. One visiting ambassador wrote that speaking with Queen Isabella was like conversing with a beautiful serpent, lovely to look upon, but deadly to the unwary. Another observer noted that she had the most enchanting smile he had ever seen, but that it never seemed to reach her eyes, which remained cold and calculating even in moments of apparent warmth. These descriptions capture something essential about Isabella's character: her ability to use her beauty and charm as weapons. She understood that people expected certain things from a beautiful woman: weakness, emotionality, a desire to please, and she used those expectations to her advantage. Her enemies consistently underestimated her because they could not believe that such a lovely feminine creature could be capable of such calculated ruthlessness. The transformation of Isabella from innocent bride to scheming queen was not sudden, but gradual, occurring over the course of many years. Each humiliation, each betrayal, each moment of powerlessness had added another layer to her psychological armor, until the original person was completely buried beneath the roles she had learned to play. By the time she returned from France in 1326 to claim her revenge, Isabella had become something unprecedented in medieval Europe, a woman who understood power as well as any man and was willing to use it with equal ruthlessness. Her relationship with Roger Mortimer illustrated this transformation perfectly. Modern romantics like to imagine their affair as a great love story, the wronged queen finding true passion with the dashing exile. But the historical evidence suggests something far more complex and calculating. Isabella chose Mortimer not because she loved him, but because he was useful to her. He had the military skills, political connections, and ruthless temperament necessary to help her reclaim her position in England. Their partnership was effective precisely because it was based on mutual self-interest, rather than romantic delusion. Both Isabella and Mortimer understood that they were using each other, and this understanding allowed them to work together with devastating efficiency. They made no demands for emotional fidelity or romantic exclusivity. They were allies first, lovers second, and partners in ambition above all else. This pragmatic approach to personal relationships was characteristic of Isabella's mature years. She had learned early that emotional attachments were vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit, and she had systematically eliminated such weaknesses from her character. Her children were assets to be managed. Her lovers were tools to be used. Her friends were allies whose loyalty had to be constantly maintained through careful manipulation. The psychological toll of living this way was enormous, but Isabella bore it with characteristic stoicism. She had sacrificed her capacity for genuine human connection in exchange for power and security, and she seems to have considered it a fair trade. Better to be feared and alone than loved and vulnerable. Better to be the predator than the prey. The methods Isabella used to maintain her position during her years of power were as sophisticated as they were ruthless. She understood that medieval politics was essentially a confidence game. Whoever could convince others that they held power would actually hold it, at least until someone else proved more convincing. Isabella was a master of this psychological manipulation, using everything from religious symbolism to sexual intrigue to maintain her hold over the English nobility. Her use of religious imagery was particularly clever. Isabella consistently presented herself as a wronged wife seeking justice, appealing to medieval notions of feminine virtue while simultaneously displaying very unfeminine political acumen. She wore widow's weeds to emphasize her victimization, attended Mass regularly to demonstrate her piety, and spoke frequently of her desire to see justice done for the wrong she had suffered. This religious framing served several purposes. It made her cause seem morally justified, even when her methods were questionable. It appealed to the medieval understanding of divine justice, suggesting that God himself supported her cause. Most importantly, it made it difficult for her enemies to attack her without seeming to attack virtue itself. At the same time, Isabella was careful to demonstrate that she possessed the traditionally masculine qualities necessary for effective rule. She could be decisive in crisis, ruthless with enemies, and strategic in her thinking. She surrounded herself with competent advisors, but made it clear that she was the one making the final decisions. She used violence when necessary, but always in service of larger political goals. This balancing act, feminine enough to seem sympathetic, masculine enough to seem competent, was extraordinary for its time and place. Medieval women were expected to be either saints or sinners, either powerless victims or scheming temptresses. Isabella managed to be both and neither, creating a new category for herself that her contemporaries struggled to understand or categorize. The final years of Isabella's life, after her fall from power, provide perhaps the most fascinating glimpse into her true character. Stripped of political authority, but still possessed of enormous wealth and social status, she could have chosen to live quietly and safely in retirement. Instead, she seems to have embraced a kind of performance of genteel domesticity that was as calculating as any of her earlier political maneuvers. Visitors to Isabella's court during these final decades invariably commented on the contrast between her fearsome reputation and her gracious reality. She entertained lavishly, dressed magnificently, and conversed brilliantly on topics ranging from theology to poetry to statecraft. She seemed to have found peace in her later years, a contentment that had eluded her during her years of struggle and triumph. But observers who looked more closely noted signs that this peaceful facade was as carefully constructed as everything else in Isabella's life. Her conversations, however brilliant, never revealed anything truly personal. Her generosity, however lavish, always seemed calculated to maintain her reputation rather than express genuine feeling. Her contentment, however convincing, had a brittle quality that suggested it could shatter at any moment. Perhaps most tellingly, Isabella never expressed any regret for her actions during her years of power. She never apologized for the destruction she had wrought, never showed remorse for the lives lost in her pursuit of revenge, never acknowledged that her methods might have been excessive. To the end of her days, she maintained that everything she had done was justified by the wrongs done to her, a position that was both psychologically necessary and morally troubling. This absence of remorse has puzzled historians for centuries. How could someone as intelligent as Isabella fail to recognize the moral complexity of her actions? How could she live with the knowledge of what she had done without feeling guilt or regret? The answer may lie in the very completeness of her psychological transformation. Isabella had not simply chosen to act ruthlessly. She had become ruthless, eliminating from her character those elements of conscience and empathy that might have interfered with her survival. This transformation was so complete that it became irreversible. Even when she no longer needed to be ruthless, even when mercy would have cost her nothing, Isabella seemed incapable of genuine softness or vulnerability. She had become what her environment demanded, and that thing could not simply be unbecome when circumstances changed. The historical legacy of Isabella of France is complex and contradictory, much like the woman herself. To some, she remains a feminist icon, a woman who refused to accept victimization and who used her intelligence and determination to claim power in a male-dominated world. Her story demonstrates that medieval women were not simply passive victims of patriarchal oppression, but could be active agents in shaping their own destinies. To others, Isabella represents the dangers of unchecked ambition and the moral corruption that inevitably follows the pursuit of power at any cost. Her transformation from innocent bride to calculating destroyer serves as a cautionary tale about what happens when human beings abandon their moral constraints in pursuit of worldly success. Both interpretations contain elements of truth, but neither captures the full complexity of Isabella's story. She was neither a simple victim nor a simple villain, but something more troubling, a human being whose circumstances demanded impossible choices and whose responses to those circumstances revealed both the best and worst possibilities of human nature. Perhaps the most important lesson of Isabella's life is not about power or politics, but about the price of survival itself. In a world that offered her no good choices, Isabella chose to survive, and she paid for that survival with her soul. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about what we might be willing to do in similar circumstances, about the moral compromises we might make if our survival depended on them. The she-wolf metaphor that attached itself to Isabella during her lifetime was more apt than her contemporaries might have realized. Wolves are not evil. They are simply predators, shaped by evolution to fill a particular ecological niche. They hunt and kill not from malice, but from necessity, following instincts honed over millions of years of natural selection. Isabella, too, was shaped by her environment into something predatory and dangerous. The medieval political world was as harsh and unforgiving as any natural ecosystem, and those who could not adapt to its demands were quickly eliminated. Isabella adapted, and in doing so, became exactly what that world required her to become: beautiful, intelligent, charming, and utterly without mercy. The tragedy of her story is not that she became a monster, but that she had no other choice. The system that created her was the real monster, a system that demanded the sacrifice of human decency for the sake of political survival, that punished compassion as weakness and rewarded cruelty as strength. Isabella was simply the most successful product of that system, the woman who learned its lessons best and applied them most effectively. In the end, Isabella of France achieved everything she set out to achieve and lost everything that mattered. She gained power, wealth, and revenge, but lost her humanity in the process. She became one of the most successful women of her age and one of the most tragic. She was both victor and victim, predator and prey, queen and slave to the very forces that made her queenship possible. Her story ends not with triumph or defeat, but with a kind of terrible fulfillment, the completion of a transformation that began when a 12-year-old girl first set foot on English soil and realized that she was alone in a world that cared nothing for her innocence or her suffering. That girl died long before Isabella's body was laid to rest in the Greyfriars Church, killed not by any external enemy, but by the very success of the woman she became. The crown was not made of gold. It was made of betrayal, of compromised innocence, of sacrificed humanity, of all the small deaths that must occur before someone can become powerful enough to command the fear and respect of an entire kingdom. Isabella wore that crown better than anyone, and it destroyed her as surely as it elevated her, until nothing remained but the legend of the She-Wolf of France, beautiful, terrible, and utterly, eternally alone. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the mists rise from the Thames and the city of London sleeps in uneasy peace, some say you can still hear her footsteps echoing through the ruins of the Greyfriars Church. They say she walks there still, the She-Wolf of France, searching for something she lost long ago but can no longer remember. Perhaps her innocence, perhaps her humanity, perhaps simply the girl she once was before the crown taught her the true meaning of power. But these are just stories, the kind of tales people tell to make sense of lives too complex for simple understanding. The real Isabella, the woman who lived and loved and betrayed and was betrayed, is beyond such neat narratives. She remains what she always was, a mystery wrapped in beauty, a tragedy disguised as triumph, a cautionary tale about the price of survival in a world that offers no mercy to the weak. Her legacy lives on not in monuments or chronicles, but in the countless women who have faced similar impossible choices in the centuries since her death. Every woman who has had to choose between her principles and her survival. Every woman who has had to sacrifice part of herself to protect those she loves. Every woman who has discovered that the world demands more strength than she thought she possessed. All of them carry something of Isabella's story within them. The crown was not made of gold. It was made of the accumulated weight of all the choices that cannot be taken back, all the innocence that cannot be recovered, all the humanity that must be sacrificed on the altar of survival. Isabella of France knew this truth better than anyone, and she wore that knowledge like a crown until the day she died, beautiful and terrible, and utterly, completely alone.